Be warned, the following contains graphic descriptions and situations not suitable to all audiences. In addition to the usual fare, this program frequently discusses manipulation, violence, death, sex, negative stereotypes, and a surprising amount of regurgitation. Listener discretion is advised. In the spring of 1895, the country was captivated by the words of a bloodthirsty madman. Under the alias H. Holmes, the villainous demon claimed to follow Satan and to have killed almost 200 men, women, and children. Images of his horrific murder castle emblazoned every front page for almost a year. And almost all of it was complete nonsense. I'm Jennifer Beck, and this is The Haunted Hustle. Once released, Mudgett followed through with his so-called demise, but failed. The insurance company was onto him almost immediately and refused to pay. Not wanting to draw any more attention, he let it slide, only to try the same plan again, this time with Peitzel. Peitzel was all in. While his friend was away sorting out his business behind bars, he had moved his family to Philadelphia and opened a fake patent office to swindle investors. Aware it wouldn't last, a fake death would help him evade victims and throw law enforcement off his scent. Plus, Mudgett's offer to split the proceeds would provide a nice bonus. With Howe on board as attorney, the men made the needed arrangements. Peitzel, now going under the alias B.F. Perry, set himself up as an inventor, spreading his backstory to neighbors. Then, with Howe's help, he purchased a $10,000 life insurance policy and listed his wife, Carrie, as the beneficiary. Mudgett sought to find an appropriate cadaver to play the role of the deceased. Then all the pair had to do was wait. Court reports and law enforcement documents show they spent a majority of 1894 traveling the countryside, visiting Missouri, Colorado, Texas, Tennessee, and New York. But they didn't exactly take in the sights. Along the way, they committed a string of frauds. Mudgett married a third time, to Georgiana Yoke. Having met him under another alias, Georgiana asked him why he suddenly changed his name to Holmes. Having either prepared for this question or simply being that adept a liar, he casually explained he had an uncle who promised to make him his heir. His delivery, if not his answer, seemed simple enough, and the couple were wed on January 17, 1894. By the fall of that year, Peitzel and the newlyweds made their way back to Philadelphia. And one night in early September, the laboratory of reclusive inventor B.F. Perry caught fire. Peitzel disappeared, and Mudgett and his wife left town in a hurry. Investigators found a corpse 3 days later, and Mudgett collected the insurance payout. Only there had been a slight change in plans, one that Mudgett had kept to himself. The entire time they were traveling, he hadn't acquired a corpse. He had his reasons. He may have been too occupied celebrating his union with the third Mrs. Mudgett. He may not have had a good way to travel so far while concealing a body. It may have been that he'd been replaying his first attempt over and over in his mind, looking for errors, and decided that explosion or not, it would be impossible to make a predeceased corpse look like an accident victim. He'd seen a good many of his insurance claims be denied the longer he ran the scams. He knew his query was becoming more savvy. Maybe the money was so good he didn't think it was worth taking the chance. Or maybe it was simply a matter of convenience. Either way, the night of the explosion, he killed Peitzel by knocking him unconscious with chloroform and then setting his body on fire with benzene. He then convinced his widow her husband was still alive. Stringing Carrie along was simple enough. Like most women in his immediate circle, she wasn't very bright, but responded well to flattery and charm. The $500 gift and the offer to look after 3 of her children didn't hurt either. Keeping her distracted and isolated allowed him to hide them from police and worried family members, as well as distract her from the rest of the settlement. Carrie could have cared less about accounting, not while she was working to reunite her family. So he took the Peitzel children and journeyed through the northern United States and into Canada, simultaneously escorting Carrie along a parallel route. To keep her from panicking, he told her her husband was hiding in London and other exotic locations, and that her children were being protected as well. At one point while traveling through Detroit, she'd been separated from them by just a few blocks. Even more shocking, Mudgett slept over in a third location with his wife, who appeared to be completely unaware of what was going on. As were the neighbors and the tenants of the castle, who by now had been left alone with free reign over the property for over a year. And yet none of them ever saw anything in the way of dungeons, crematories, mass graves, or torture chambers. After playing a shell game with Carrie and her children for about 6 weeks, Mudgett had yet to come up with a plan. So he opted to eliminate as many witnesses as possible. On October 25, 1894, while in Toronto, he forced young Nellie and Alice into a large trunk, locking them inside. On the lid, he drilled a hole large enough to feed a tube. At the other end, he attached a gas line. The girls asphyxiated. He buried their bodies in the cellar of a rental house, stripped naked to delay identification. But this act wouldn't buy him much time. Once Hedgepath learned about the explosion, he was angry he'd been shorted his share. So he alerted Fidelity Mutual Insurance Company, whose investigators tracked him down. Mudgett was located in Boston as he was preparing to flee the country. Initially, thinking he was merely a prolific and gifted swindler, he was arrested and held on suspicion of fraud and an outstanding warrant for horse theft in Texas. Soon, investigators uncovered evidence linking him to Peitzel's murder and reported it to police. On November 20th, Carrie Peitzel was arrested and confessed her involvement to Detective Frank Geyer. Satisfied neither she nor Howe were capable of devising such a plot, each was released. It was then up to investigators to build a case for what the news was already calling the crime of the century. Weeks passed as Mudgett remained in jail while detectives focused on forcing their captive to confess. But it didn't appear to bother him. In the face of an awaiting trial and frequent interrogations, he remained smug and aloof, bragging, "Fraud is all you can prove, my buck." But they worked the angles they could, badgering him about what happened to the Williams sisters and the Peitzel children. In time, he grew impatient. Or maybe he just thought he could test the waters. Quote, "Oh, those Williams girls! Why, Minnie killed her sister during a jealous quarrel. To save her, I put Nanny's body in a trunk, threw it into Lake Michigan, and sent Minnie to Europe. She's there now. I think the Peitzel children are with her." But the next day, he recanted, forcing investigators to start all over again. Desperate for some kind of sign of her children, Carrie told the police everything she could about her time on the road with Mudgett, including as many dates and locations as she recalled. They used this information to form a timeline and set about retracing his steps. In July 1895, they recovered the girls' bodies, and later unearthed the charred remains of their brother in Indianapolis. Following their discovery, Chicago police and reporters began investigating the castle. In it, they found nothing to tie him to any crime more severe than credit fraud. Still, this didn't stop newspapers from reporting that they had. Based on headlines out east, Midwest reporters stepped up in kind, creating more horrific and outlandish claims of their own. Chicago was alarmed and excited at once, and anyone with any connection to Mudgett or his castle ran to the newspaper to sell their story. Back in Philadelphia, Mudgett changed his story to Detective Geyer daily. He would claim he had no idea where the children were, then turn around and suggest they were with an accomplice, or their father, or an old flame. He adopted the same strategy when it came to the insurance fraud charges, seeming to acknowledge involvement only to turn around and claim innocence. Eventually, Geyer grew tired of the games and informed him of the horse theft charges that awaited him in Texas. It got Mudgett's attention quick. That was a serious charge. In Texas, it was a capital offense that came with a death sentence. Unaware Peitzel had been identified and that a murder case was mounting, he offered to cooperate with Geyer in order to delay extradition. So he confessed to his participation in the insurance scheme, but only as an accomplice. Yep, he lied again. At first, he claimed the body had been a cadaver he obtained for the purpose. When it was clear Geyer knew more about the body than he let on, Mudgett changed his story, admitting the body was Peitzel's, but that his death had been a suicide. He said he found the body of his friend along with a note asking him to give the proceeds of his life insurance policy to his family. Thinking only of them, he selflessly made the scene appear to be an accident. It was the Christian thing to do. Of the children, Mudgett claimed they were with Minnie Williams in London. He hadn't heard from her, not since he'd been locked up in jail anyway, but he suggested they start their search there. When the charred remains of the boy were found in Indiana, he claimed he had no idea what Geyer was talking about, as he did when the two girls were found. With the connection to their deaths confirmed, the police and the public started speculating on how many more disappearances he may be responsible for. The media scoured through police reports and supposed eyewitness accounts of practically every suspected missing person between Colorado and New York. Reporters also approached Mudgett, who at first refused to indulge them, but when Hearst offered to pay him $7,500 for his story, over $250,000 today, a story is exactly what he got. His so-called confession captivated readers, and with it came a flood of attention and a new market he could manipulate. In it, he claimed he killed 27 people, including a list of their names and a mode of death in chronological order. Even then, the public noticed his facts didn't line up. Some of the supposed victims he mentioned were still verifiably alive. But that hardly mattered. It was a good story, and when his handwritten cover letter appeared on the front page of the New York Journal, people were willing to make exceptions. Nor were they bothered by the fact that the story didn't match his first public confession, one he made to the Philadelphia Inquirer, where he promised them an exclusive for a smaller sum. And so the race to feed the public's appetite and scoop the competition was off. Despite the lack of evidence, or perhaps because of it, newspapers sensationalized the scant findings and dubbed the Chicago property the Murder Castle. Fictional blueprints began to pop up on front pages throughout the country, most of which were completely bogus, drawn by the same in-house artists that drew political cartoons. And of course, Mudgett was happy to contribute for a price. In later versions of his confession, he added sinister quotes like, "I was born with the devil in me," and increased his supposed victim count to more than 130. Once it was clear reporters were more interested in the horrific than the specific, he stopped trying to invent new names and modes of death, simply saying that there were too many to remember. But of the many things that changed during Mudgett's multiple retellings, one remained constant. Time and time again, he continued to imply Peitzel was dead prior to the fire. In fact, forensic evidence confirmed chloroform had been administered after his death. It was a detail that remained unknown until trial, but one Mudgett was careful to include, perhaps in an attempt to bolster his claims of suicide and exonerate himself. But it backfired. The insurance company hadn't been privy to that information until after the trial began, and editors were quick to remove any claims of his self-restraint in order to make more room for coverage of his satanic worship. For their part, the police had little time for headlines filled with Mudgett's lies and mass hysteria. They were having enough trouble sorting out Mudgett's statements to them. He offered several varieties of the story that Julia ran off in the middle of the night with her daughter Pearl before claiming she died during an abortion. It was the most plausible theory, and one no doubt investigators had suspected from the beginning. Mudgett's medical background would have given him a working knowledge of the procedure, at least enough to inspire him to try. And as cold as it was, the risk of a dead mistress was still better than a bastard baby. Afterwards, he told investigators he poisoned Pearl to tie up loose ends. A partial skeleton, possibly of a child around her age, was found while excavating the cellar. Emmeline met a similar fate with another botched abortion and cover-up. And they were flooded with calls from others wondering if he had hurt their missing loved ones as well. 4 years earlier, Emily Van Tassel disappeared after working at the castle's drugstore. In 1897, her name was added to the list of suspected victims at the behest of her mother, but there was no proof connecting him and no sign of her was ever found. Dr. Russler and Kitty Kelly worked at the castle in 1892 and went missing, but no evidence of them was found either. Lucy Burbank's bank book was found there in 1895, but that wasn't enough to outweigh the possibility of it simply being lost or stolen. It's been circulated that Harry Walker of Greensburg, Indiana, went missing in November 1893 after allegedly writing to friends about working in Chicago for Mudgett and that he had taken out a life insurance policy on him in the amount of $20,000. But this was quickly discredited. The letter was too detailed to be believable. And once Mudgett was arrested and word got out about his prolific scheme, every insurance company in the country pored over their records in search of policies under the Holmes alias or one of his many others. But none for Walker was ever found. John Davis is often listed as a suspected victim simply because he visited the World's Fair and vanished. But Chicago was a big place, and there is nothing else tying the two together. There were also some coming forward with claims of a more self-serving nature. One witness claimed Mudgett killed a drugstore patron after insuring his life and pouring black liquid down his throat. But the claims were too outrageous, and the nearly 70-year-old supposed victim's death certificate listed he died of natural causes. Francis Winsaw told police he'd encountered Holmes in Toronto and knew he was innocent of the murders. He was quickly exposed as a charlatan. Philadelphia reporters discovered he'd never met Mudgett in Toronto or anywhere else. When his own background of nerve-tonic scams and seances became newsworthy, he backed off and claimed his information came from clairvoyant spirits on the astral plane. Playwright and citizen detective Robert Corbett published a pamphlet in August of 1895 in which he claimed Mudgett was framed and the victim of a vicious female cabal. Filled with suppositions and conspiracy theories, Corbett claimed Minnie was living in Europe, Julia and Pearl were in Michigan, and Emily was simply in, quote, one of our large cities. To further publicize himself and his quote-unquote truth, he embarked on a search for Edward Hatch, the fictional fiend Mudgett implicated in the Peitzel children's murder. He was soon discredited by Chicago journalists as a wife-beater, who had been evicted from several apartments for non-payment of rent. And a few women following the story claimed to have fallen in love with him and wrote letters to the police, the courts, and newspapers begging for clemency. We'll unpack that another time. Holmes's murder trial started in confusion on October 28, 1895. To call it a dumpster fire would be kind. Defense attorneys William A. Shoemaker and Samuel Roten opened the hearing by requesting a postponement on the grounds that they didn't have sufficient time to prepare. Witnesses helpful to their client's cause hadn't cooperated, and neither was the defendant. Judge Michael Arnold rejected their motion and ordered the trial to begin, at which point Mudgett stood and requested permission to act as his own lawyer. The courtroom was shocked. No accused murderer in the United States had ever done so before. Judge Arnold advised him that he had the right to do so, but voiced his opinion that it would not be in his best interest. At that point, Shoemaker also stood and attempted to resign as Mudgett's counsel, but the judge slapped that back as well and threatened him with disbarment if he tried that again or failed to attend future proceedings. A reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer described Mudgett's performance as vigorous and remarkable. Respectful to the court, he openly scorned the defense attorney. He conducted himself appropriately during jury selection. He asked for Peitzel's toxicology reports, claiming that as a doctor, he could analyze them himself. He also asked for an analysis of the liquid he was accused of using to poison the children, something the prosecution had to admit they didn't have. It left the courtroom with the impression of a rushed prosecution against a learned man preparing to use science to exonerate himself. But in cross-examination, he often deflected from questioning facts and conclusions in favor of semantics and trivial details. He frequently exchanged barbs with the prosecutors, who were no doubt irked by having to spar with a murderer as if he were their peer. In anticipation of more stunts and tales, the DA subpoenaed 35 witnesses from throughout the country. But during Geyer's testimony, in which he referenced his interviews with Carey and the discovery of the remains of the Peitzel children, the defense objected on grounds of relevance. To the prosecution's dismay, Judge Arnold sustained the motion, ruling them irrelevant to the case at hand. Medical examiner Dr. William Scott testified he examined Peitzel's body at the scene and concluded he could not have possibly died from an explosion. The visage, he claimed, was too composed. Objects like a steno pad and the victim's pipe, still fresh with tobacco, remained undisturbed. And glass fragments from the chemical bottles strewn throughout the lab remained conspicuously close to their original locations, not cast about by force. Carrie Peitzel was also called to the stand, accompanied by a nurse who periodically administered smelling salts. She was so weak and broken that the court reporter was frequently asked to repeat segments of her testimony so the judge, attorneys, and jury could hear it. The widow testified to the life insurance scam proposed by Mudgett to her husband, how he had set up the policy, and how he continued to falsely reassure her of his survival and her children's long after they disappeared. When the DA showed her the scorched clothing found on Peitzel's remains, she identified them as his before breaking down in tears. The prosecution also called acquaintances to the stand in order to cast doubt on the suicide theory. A carpenter, a bartender, and the owner of a tobacco shop, all people familiar with Peitzel and his activities in the days leading up to his death, testified he was in good spirits. They testified he'd also recently stockpiled a week's supply of whiskey and cigars, unlikely behavior for someone planning to kill themselves. In addition, the carpenter who discovered Peitzel's body testified he'd done work for him in the past and was familiar with the defendant. He said he thought Mudgett was Peitzel's boss because he visited frequently and possessed keys to the apartment. But after his death, the boss was nowhere to be found. Toxicology expert Dr. Henry Lefman testified that the chloroform found in Peitzel's digestive system hadn't been absorbed by the stomach. The findings indicated the drug was injected into the abdomen post-mortem and not swallowed. In addition, the victim's skin had cooked rather than blistered in the fire, further supporting the conclusion he was dead when the fire occurred. After spending hours listening to graphic testimony, the gallery and jury were quite moved. When the witness was turned over for cross-examination, Mudgett requested a recess for lunch. To the general shock of those watching, he appeared unaffected by the demise of his friend. He continued cross-examination in a similar manner after the trial resumed, failing to make any witness corroborate that Peitzel may have died, as he claimed, by suicide. As the afternoon drew on, the judge ordered the trial to continue into the evening, over Mudgett's objections. He claimed to be feeling ill, but it was clear his defense was eroding and the judge just wanted to get it over with. Reading the room when the evening session began, he informed the court his attorneys would be taking over his defense. Roten objected when the DA called Georgiana to the stand on grounds she was the defendant's wife. But as the marriage had been invalid from its inception, Judge Arnold overruled. When she walked past his table on her way to the witness stand, Mudgett visibly wept. Some might say a little too visibly. I'll let you decide. Maintaining her composure, Georgiana testified that he left their apartment on September 2nd at 10 o'clock and didn't return until around 4 that evening. When he did, she said he was sweaty, disheveled, and anxious to get out of town. Using an uncharacteristic amount of emotion, Mudgett attempted to get his paramour to recant, but failed. The defense reluctantly rested. During their 2-hour closing arguments, the DA called Mudgett the most dangerous man in the world and challenged jurors to do their duty as honest men. Having called no witnesses, Grattan reminded the jury of the prosecution's burden and said they failed to make their case. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before returning to the courtroom. The verdict? Guilty. Mudgett's attorneys worked every angle to appeal or overturn the decision, but when those were exhausted later that month, Judge Arnold denied his last motion for a new trial and sentenced him to hang. While awaiting execution at Moyamensing Prison, he penned an autobiography filled with outrageous lies and did his best to continue his macabre payday. With one notable denial. He claimed to be completely innocent of the murder for which he was about to hang, describing himself as but a very ordinary man, even below the average in physical strength and mental ability. The chilling memoir sold well before he renounced the entire thing in order to sell an entirely different version of his tale to the New York Journal. On Sunday, April 12, 1896, a facsimile of a handwritten note appeared on the front page, which read, "To the New York Journal, I positively and emphatically deny the assertions that any confession has been made by me except one, and which is the only one that will be made. Quote, to have planned and executed the stupendous amount of wrongdoing that has been attributed to me would have been wholly beyond my power." As if that would satisfy any doubts about the others, he added, "The original confession is the one given to the New York Journal. It alone is genuine, all others are untrue. Signed H. Holmes, April 11, 1896. But in his last moments on Earth, he would attempt to flip the story again. On May 7th, as he stood on the gallows and made his final statement, he denied killing anyone other than Julia and Emmeline. Quote, I only want to say that to the extent of my wrongdoings in the taking of human life consisted in the death of 2 women, they having died at my hands as the result of criminal operations, because by not speaking, I may be made to acquiesce in my execution. Yeah, even the very last words out of his mouth were a lie. As if the universe had finally had enough and decided to weigh in, when hanged, the noose failed to break his neck. He strangled to death slowly, twitching for over 15 minutes before he was pronounced dead. His body was interred in an unmarked grave at Holy Cross Cemetery in Yeadon, Pennsylvania. At his request, he was buried 10 feet below ground in a pine coffin filled with cement. You know, in order to discourage grave robbers. One can't be too careful, you know. On New Year's Eve, 1909, Hedgepeth was shot and killed by police during a holdup at a Chicago bar. On March 7, 1914, Patrick Quinlan, the former caretaker of the castle, committed suicide by ingesting strychnine. His body was found in his bedroom with a note that read, "I couldn't sleep." His surviving relatives claimed he'd been haunted for several months and was suffering from hallucinations. The castle itself was damaged by a fire in August of 1895. 2 men were seen entering the back of the building around 9 o'clock that evening and noticed about a half an hour later, rapidly running away. Following several explosions, the castle went up in flames. Afterwards, investigators found a half-empty gas tank underneath the back steps of the building. The structure itself survived and remained in use until it was torn down in 1938. The site now houses a post office. Stay tuned after the break for more about the aftermath of H.H. Holmes. In 2017, following ridiculous but still prolific rumors he had escaped execution, Mudgett's body was exhumed for testing by the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. When uncovered, researchers found his remains, clothing, and even his mustache were largely intact, due in no small part to his bizarre burial request. Through dental records, something largely unknown by the public at the time and impossible to recreate, he was positively identified before returning to the grave and his sentence. This has been The Haunted Hustle. Thanks for listening. The Haunted Hustle is an original production of Toil and Trouble Media, executive produced by Jennifer Beck. This episode was also written and performed by Jennifer Beck. I'm kind of a big deal. Additional production assistance was provided by Erin Iris, and our music was by Kevin MacLeod, Light Saturation, and the Schizoid Nightmares. Thanks, guys. If you've enjoyed our podcast, and I really hope you do, be sure to subscribe to your favorite podcast provider and follow us on social media so you'll never miss an episode. And give us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Heck, give us a 5-star rating on all of them. We can use all the stars we can get. And help us spread the word. Tell your friends about our show and its totally bingeable content. Tell your spirit guides too. We're not picky. And if you want to help us bring even more Toil and Trouble to the world, check out our merch and our Patreon pages. We have a link at toilandtroublemedia.com, or you can find it on Patreon itself. Just look for a sign. Well, it's the owl, but close enough. And as always, thanks for listening.